Welcome to the Doherty Water for Food podcast. Since 2010, the Doherty Water for Food Global Institute at the University of Nebraska has worked toward one goal, a food and water secure world. One in which global food security is ensured without compromising the use of water to meet other essential human and environmental needs. It's a daunting vision, but one that is vitally important. This podcast amplifies the voices of those making waves in this space. We hope you enjoy today's episode.
Welcome to the Water for Food podcast. My name is Ariana Alness. I'm the communications specialist at the Doherty Water for Food Global Institute. And today I'm talking with Crystal Powers, who's the communications specialist for the Nebraska Water Center and has co-authored a case study on the Managed Aquifer Recharge Project in Central Platte Valley, Nebraska. The project was recently published by UNESCO, giving the case global recognition as one of 28 examples of how communities have used managed aquifer recharge to overcome water challenges, prepare for the future, increase safety of water supplies, and enhance ecosystems. I'm looking forward to learning more about how managed aquifer recharge was successfully implemented in Central Platte Valley and how, in this case, the community was able to use this form of management to satisfy both agricultural needs and create habitat for endangered wildlife. Crystal, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. And I guess before we dive into the specific project in Nebraska, I want to just talk about managed aquifer recharge. I just recently learned about this, and it may be a new concept for many of our listeners.
So managed aquifer recharge is a way of managing water so that you can take it and get it back in the groundwater so that it can be used for all sorts of purposes at a different time when it's needed.
Why is managed aquifer recharge important?
So one of the challenges in global water supplies, and here in Nebraska is as well, is that groundwater is one of our best sources, but it's also a limited source of water. And so they're trying to find ways to enhance the storage in our groundwater. That's the least expensive way and most reliable way to store water is in the ground. And so managed aquifer recharge is a way to use that naturally occurring storage.
What can be learned from the projects in the UNESCO publication, and how can the learnings be applied?
So the UNESCO book was a really great collection of projects worldwide that showed how groundwater recharge can be done in a whole variety of ways. And they wanted these to be really practical case studies so that anybody in the world can see all these different examples and hopefully find a project that could be useful in their region and then be able to contact those authors and maybe put it into practice.
Who contributed to the projects in this publication?
The UNESCO book has case studies from all over the world that were done by water managers and academic institutions looking at practical projects.
Who do you hope reads this collection?
I think that this collection of stories will be useful for water managers all over the world, particularly those who are managing groundwater, to find some practical ways that they can help contribute back to their groundwater storage.
About the Managed Aquifer Recharge Project in Central Platte Valley, Nebraska, can you tell me about this study?
Our project took place in the Central Platte River Valley in Nebraska, and so it was in the Central Platte Natural Resource District. So there are local water management district who is in charge of groundwater in their region. And so this was a project where they worked with some of the surface water irrigation that has been in place in that district for over 100 years to use those canals as a formal way to store water in the off season so that it'll percolate down through the soil and recharge the aquifer.
Tell me a bit about the history of this project.
So this project began over 100 years ago when surface water was the most common way to irrigate. And so the Platte River was a source of irrigation water for the valley all around it, and irrigation canals were put in place. Fast forward to today, where we have a mixture of groundwater irrigation and surface water irrigation, but both of those impact the river. And so there's a program for the Platte River called the Platte River Recovery Implementation Program, where they're trying to make sure there's enough water for endangered species in the Platte. So these are things like the whooping crane and the least tern, which are two different birds, which are federally endangered. And so as part of that program, they're trying to make sure that there's plenty of water in the river. Part of the way they do that is through managed aquifer recharge, by taking extra water, what they call extra water, in the winter, putting it back in the ground, and that slows it down so that it slowly comes back into the river all year round, making sure that there's always water there when the birds need it. And so what they did was the Central Platte Natural Resource District partnered with those irrigation canals that have been there for a long time to say, in the wintertime, can we use your canals? Because they just use them in the summer for irrigation. In the wintertime, can we use your canal to put water in, and then those canals, and let it sit, and it slowly sinks into the ground. And then, so if you can imagine, it takes a longer amount of time to get back to the river. So it's a way of storing that water underground so that it slowly comes back and is there when birds and the rest of the wildlife need it. Another benefit of this particular project is that by storing that water in the groundwater around the river, that provides water also for the irrigators of the Central Platte. So it benefits both the wildlife and the agriculture of the whole valley.
This project was initiated about 10 years ago. What have been some of the indicators of environmental sustainability?
So many of the ways that they're tracking success for this project are through the amount of water and wildlife are both being monitored throughout the life of this project. And so particularly they're watching very closely how much water they bring into those canals, and then they can look at how much is stored, and using groundwater models they can then predict what time that water will come back into the river. And so they're really doing a lot of water accounting to find out where the water is at what time to make sure that it benefits both the wildlife that's in the federal program as well as the ag irrigators throughout the valley.
What are some of the economic costs and benefits?
One of the economic advantages of this project is that the infrastructure was already in place. The canals were already existing, and the water, like I said, you can argue if there's truly excess flows, but in the way this is managed, we've got a lot of entities working together, and there is still extra water in the Platte in the wintertime when there's high flows. And so it all works through gravity, so there's not an energy component. And so the idea is that this is getting the most beneficial use out of that water, and then bringing it back in timing so that it has the broadest benefit across the whole valley.
Why is this case study significant in the overall picture of the publication and discussion of managed aquifer recharge?
I think one of the reasons this was a great example to include, because we've got several other examples in Nebraska of managed aquifer recharge. It's something that many of our water managers have done well. I think this particular project is a great example of using existing infrastructure for additional benefits. Another great advantage of this particular example in Nebraska is that it's a place where the people, the wildlife, and the water system are all benefiting together, and using a really low cost, low energy method to provide those benefits.
So on this project, was it the NRD who took the lead, or who proposed that it be a more coordinated effort?
So this was really initiated at the local level, which is what's really cool about how Nebraska manages water. The Natural Resource District in that area knew that they wanted to work with these irrigation districts, because the irrigation districts needed to clean up their canal. They're 100 years old, so they need maintenance. And so they knew they needed to do that. The NRD knew they were interested in this groundwater piece, and then they worked really closely with the Nebraska Department of Natural Resources, who helps do integrated water management planning. So those three groups came up with this really local plan to figure out how to make sure this water ends up in the river when they need it. In Nebraska, we have this very local water management system where the public can does have lots of opportunities to engage in the process. And I think that that's a real strength of how we manage water in Nebraska. And so all of these local boards can get together and talk about how do we work well together to manage the water.
This is just such a successful story of multiple stakeholders coming together. And I hope that our listeners can learn from and creatively implement this in their own communities as well. Thank you so much for joining me today. And if our listeners would like to read more about this project, it can be found on the Water for Food website.
Thanks for joining us this time on the Doherty Water for Food podcast. Make sure to visit our website, waterforfood.nebraska.edu, to view show notes or subscribe so you don't miss future episodes.